Okay, load master, load up 4 in the rear, will you? Roger, sir, loading 4.
Got your flares in sight now, Blind Bat. I'm going to start down.
Roger, roger, and you should be able to see the buildings and stuff like that just as the forward makes the bend in the river there, looks like.
We're picking up some ground fire down there, it looks like. I'm going to have to change my running heading. I'll still turn left here and keep clear of you.
044 Ironhead. Ironhead 2, roger. Ironhead 2, roger. Green 044 Ironhead 2, are you coming in this time? Ironhead 2, roger. Green deck, wind 0354, 9 knots over.
The word hero has been so misapplied in recent history that its true meaning has become lost. Victims are people who unfortunately find themselves in harm's way. Heroes are men and women who put themselves in harm's way in order to protect a higher ideal. James Bond Stockdale is a true hero, a man who put himself in harm's way, was captured, and then from behind enemy walls, was able to lead his men and return home. Stockdale found strength and aid from his wife, but from within found the ability to stay alive through awful torture and solitary confinement. True heroes survive and inspire others to follow suit, as James Stockdale did. James Bond Stockdale was born on December 23, 1923. Raised in Abingdon, Illinois, young James was an achiever from the beginning. He lettered in football, basketball, and track, and graduated second in his high school class. In 1943, the young Midwesterner became Midshipman Stockdale after his appointment to the Naval Academy. His time at Annapolis changed his life in more ways than one. It was there he met Sybil.
The chemistry teacher at St. Catherine's School was engaged to a midshipman at the Naval Academy, and she asked me and my roommate to go on a blind date to the Naval Academy, which we did, and Midshipman Stockdale was my date. He'd had a bad experience a couple of weeks before, and so he told, Ann Rogers was her name, he told Ann's fiancé that he wouldn't sign up for this blind date unless he could look the two girls over first and decide which one he wanted to have as a date. Of course, he didn't know that my roommate was 6 feet tall. And so probably we got together because of height, and I did have a car. So I've always thought maybe we got together because of my height and the fact that I had a car.
She had a car. That was one of the amazing things. In 1946, World War II was just over, and she had this old convertible coupe, so that was a real plus. And she would drive up a couple of times before I graduated.
The handsome midshipman made a big impression on the young co-ed.
I was walking downtown with my roommate's sister, who was also a teacher at the school, and she was asking me about the weekend, and she said, did you like him? And I said, I think I've met the man I want to marry. She said, oh, God. She said, how can you say a thing like that? She said, you've just met him. I can't imagine how you could say such an irresponsible thing. And I said, well, I don't know whether it's going to work out or not, but I think he's the one I'd like to marry if I can pull it off.
After Midshipman Stockdale became Ensign Stockdale, Sybil pulled it off.
She was at the graduation. It was not time to be married or anything like that yet, but within a year after that, we got married at her home in Connecticut.
That same year, Stockdale reported to Pensacola, Florida for flight training. Proving to be a very efficient pilot, Stockdale flew almost every type of aircraft in the arsenal. Longing for a greater challenge, Stockdale applied to the test pilot school located in Patuxent River, Maryland in 1954. He was one of 17 accepted, along with John Glenn. While at Patuxent, James Stockdale proved to be the best of the best. He logged over 1,000 hours in a F-8U Crusader, which was the Navy's most prolific new fighter. Accolades would follow, and soon Stockdale would be in charge of his own squadron. And the squadron was about to go to war. By midsummer 1964, events were taking place in the Gulf of Tonkin that would lead to the first open clash between U.S. and North Vietnamese forces. In late July, the destroyer USS Maddox was on patrol in the Gulf, gathering intelligence, becoming the object of interest by communists in North Vietnam. From July 31st to August 1st, the Maddox cruised unfettered along a predetermined route off the North Vietnamese coast. In the early morning hours of August 2nd, the crew learned that a possible attack could take place from the communists. The attack by 3 North Vietnamese P-4 torpedo boats, PT boats, materialized shortly after 4 p.m. on August 2nd. The Maddox fired off 3 warning volleys and then opened fire with all guns in the direction of the attack. Four F-8 Crusaders, led by Commander James B. Stockdale from the aircraft carrier USS Ticonderoga, also took part in the skirmish. The result of the 20-minute affair saw 1 gunboat sunk and another crippled. The Maddox, ordered out of the Gulf after the incident concluded, was hit by 1 14.5-millimeter shell. On August 3rd, the Maddox, accompanied by the destroyer USS C. Turner Joy, received instructions to re-enter the Gulf and resume patrol. The USS Constellation was ordered to join the Ticonderoga, stationed at the mouth of the Gulf in the South China Sea. The 2 destroyers cruised without incident, and in the daylight hours of August 4th, moved to the middle of the Gulf. Parallel to the movements of the C. Turner Joy and Maddox, South Vietnamese gunboats launched attacks on several North Vietnamese radar installations. The North Vietnamese believed the U.S. destroyers were connected with these strikes. At 8:41 p.m. on August 4th, both destroyers reportedly picked up fast-approaching contacts on their radars. Naval documentation showed the ships changed course to avoid the unknown vessels, but the contacts continued intermittently. At 10:39 p.m., when the Maddox and C. Turner Joy radars indicated 1 enemy vessel had closed to within 7,000 yards, the C. Turner Joy was ordered to open fire. And the Maddox soon followed. For the next several hours, the destroyers, covered by the Ticonderogas and the Constellation's aircraft, reportedly evaded torpedoes and fired on their attackers. The controversy over the incidents of these days is well known, but to the men who were there was no doubt. In Stockdale's words, "I flew so low there was salt spray on my windshield, and I still didn't see a thing," meaning he never saw torpedoes or any evidence that the U.S. ships had been fired upon. The captain of the Ticonderoga's Attack Squadron 56, Commander Wesley L. McDonald, concurred. He didn't see anything that night except the Maddox and the Turner Joy. After this flight, he and those in his command met behind closed doors, and each wrote accounts of what they did and did not see. Stockdale then locked these reports in his safe. The next morning, Commander James Stockdale was ordered to lead the first U.S. airstrike on North Vietnam. The target was the North Vietnamese Navy Oil Reserve. America was now at war. At the same time, coordinated attacks from F-8s, Sky Raiders, and Skyhawks launched from the USS Constellation, bombed and destroyed targets on Ben Thuy Naval Base, Quang Key, Han Mei Island, and Hanji's Inner Harbor. The mission was a success, with 90% destruction of the oil fields achieved. And as a result, Stockdale, on his second tour of duty, was given command of Air Wing 16 on board the USS Orensky. For his prowess as an air commander, and for his ability to survive in the unforgiving world of naval aviation, Stockdale was given command of an air wing. On September 9, 1965, during his second tour in the Gulf, Stockdale was once again rocketing off a carrier.
We were assigned the Thanhua Bridge strike the last day of our at sea period. We were going to Hong Kong the next day. I let the Marines take their own airplanes. They were going to take all the F-8s. I just wanted myself to be there as a kind of in case. And we had about 27 planes going with us that day, I think.
What should have been a routine mission began to turn bad.
We were just reaching the beach when we had sent ahead a weather plane, and he said, it's 0-0 at the bridge. By that he meant that the visibility was 0 at sea level. It was impossible target to hit under the conditions that we had in the weather. So I hadn't assigned myself as a wingman, but we had the executive, 163 was right there with me. He said, I'll go with you, and we went up to, this was all downhill. All we had to do was go up and get rid of our bombs, and these were smaller bombs on the A4s. I had found an area up to the north where I had almost always brought my excess bombs back and dropped them into a rail yard where boxcars were parked. I figured they did some good. I'd been up there the day before. When we rolled in at low level, we were going to use this, what they call the snake eye delivery technique, which is low altitude, flat to the ground.
Suddenly, the safe target erupted in a hail of fire.
I had just pickled off the bombs when I heard this boom, boom, boom over to the right, and it's a loud engine in that airplane, but I was close enough to this thing to see a wheeled vehicle on which was mounted a 57 millimeter gun. They weren't there yesterday, but here they were. And I had a plane on fire, and I was out of that plane in the ejection seat, and we were treetop level. We were pretty low. So I had a very short ride to the ground.
Stockdale was out of the plane, but the danger was not over.
I could see the bullets ripping my parachute. I landed, I hooked a tree, but that didn't last long. I was finally on the ground with on my own feet when the mob, which was thundering down the street. It's like every little town in Illinois, every little town in the world. They've got a bunch of teenage or early 20s goons who are, they're going to defend the honor of the city. And this was and boy, they hit me like a pack of, like a quarterback sack. And then I had about a minute of being twisted and bent and kicked, but I wasn't really conscious of what was happening, except that I was being bashed heavily. And then a guy with a pith helmet, I saw his helmet later, he blew a whistle, and that ended that phase. And this guy, civilian with a pith helmet, took charge.
The hotshot pilot was now a POW.
I arrived in prison in a stretcher that had been put in the back of an old truck that I finally was put in to get up to Hanoi. It was Sunday morning. I looked out there and I saw that prison, and the driver of the truck went in to rouse somebody, and then the officer came out with him, and they were saw me in the stretcher, and they were going to have some men haul me in. But I looked at the scene of a kind of a rainy Sunday morning in Hanoi, not knowing that I would never see that street for 7.5 years. Any time they carried me out of that prison or took me out, I was blindfolded and handcuffed. So, I mean, you know, this was not going to be a prison camp where you sat around the fire and talked about home. This was a penitentiary.
This was the infamous Hoa Lo prison complex, not far from the center of Hanoi. Stockdale's first year in the prison was painful because the beating he suffered from the villagers gave him a broken leg. Not receiving medical treatment prolonged his ordeal. It would be a year before he was finally able to walk without crutches. Back at home in California, Sybil Stockdale received word that her husband had gone missing.
I had been to see Hello Dolly, the play Hello Dolly, that afternoon, and the little boys didn't like to go to sleep upstairs by themselves because it's an old house and sometimes it would make noises and so forth. And so I was upstairs watching television while they went off to sleep, and I heard somebody talking down below. It was about 10 o'clock. Our oldest son, Jimmy, slept downstairs in the apartment below. And he was 14, and I thought I heard him talking to somebody, and I couldn't imagine who could be there at that hour of the night. And so I started through the bedroom, and my best friend, Doyen Salsig, was coming up the stairs. And I said, "What are you doing here?" And she grabbed me and hugged me and said, "Jim is missing." And I thought, how could he be missing? I really had not heard the term missing. I was not familiar with that phrase. Or missing, I had not heard the word necessarily in that context. And I thought, how could he be missing? You can't be missing. God would know where you were. That's the thought that went through my head. He was listed as missing in action, and he stayed listed as missing in action for 8 months.
Not only was Sybil a wife, but she was also a mother. And as she worried about her husband, she also knew she had to face the possibility of raising her young family alone.
I decided I had to proceed. I had to decide whether I was going to proceed as if he were dead or alive, and I decided I would proceed as if he were alive. Then it seemed to me I had 3 choices about my behavior. I could either become an alcoholic and remove myself from reality, or I could rave and rant and scream and wring my hands, or I could try to cope to the best of my ability. And it seemed to me that the first 2 would only make things worse rather than better. And so I decided I would try to cope to the best of my ability.
Her concerns for James's whereabouts prompted her to seek out other women whose husbands had also been listed as missing in action in Vietnam.
At the time we were with the early in prison, when the L.B. Johnson administration was in, there was a hesitancy, or in fact, they didn't want the women to get organized and start being bothersome, the wives of these growing numbers of pilots who were being shot down. And they said, Sybil called it the keep quiet policy. They were instructed to never be interviewed by a press person, never to say anything that would get out in the media. And it was terribly oppressive, and the government would not give the other, if a wife like Sybil wanted to make friends with another person in her predicament, it was verboten for her to, the government wouldn't give the other names out. Well, finally, she was under this keep quiet policy. We were living in a little town, which we still do, Coronado, California, and she would it became known that there were 4 or 5 others in town who were equally in doubt as to whether her husband was alive or not. And so they got acquainted, and finally she went to the press.
It had been 7 months since James Stockdale had gone missing when something miraculous happened.
on the morning of the 15th of April, 1966, I walked out on the front porch. I was going to do some errands, and I took the mail out of the mailbox, and I flipped through the mail. And it was rather discouraging because there were some bills and what looked like advertising circulars with no stamps on the front, and I was kind of discouraged. And then I suddenly realized that the handwriting on the front of one of those things I thought was an advertising circular looked familiar, and I went back, and sure enough, I was looking at Jim's handwriting. And I turned this letter over, and on the back were 4 stamps from Vietnam and a postmark, Hanoi. Then I looked at the one beneath it, and it was not addressed in Jim's handwriting, but it was addressed in a foreign handwriting with the 7 made like a capital F, as a foreigner would make a 7, and it had the stamps on the back and the postmark, Hanoi. And of course, this right there told me he had survived the shoot-down. He had written this letter anyway that was addressed in his hand, but had he since died? Why was this other one addressed in a foreign hand? And I thought, now which one shall I open first? And I thought, well, if he's dead, I would rather know it when I read. So I opened the second one first, and the second one was in a completely unfamiliar kind of a block printing, but it started Dearest Sib, and the letter was from Jim. Then I went back to the first letter, and that was also from Jim. It was written on the day after Christmas, 1965. And the second one was written in February of 1966.
Sybil now knew she still had a husband, but there was something strange about what he had written.
In the first, he said he'd never seen an American since he'd been shot down, that he thought he'd lost some weight, and the whole thing was very clear and very cogent up to one point where he talked about stopping by at the Schugerts and paying Paul Engel back some stamps. And it was totally it didn't make any sense, because the people he were talking about were 400 miles north at Lemoore Naval Air Station. Then he said at the end, say hello to my old football buddies, Bobby Tom, Baldy, and Red Dog. Well, that didn't make any sense. And I was kind of worried about that. And the second letter started by saying, one thinks of Vietnam as a tropical country, but there is cold and darkness even at noon. Well, of course, I was completely familiar with that book, Darkness at Noon, by Kessler. And it's about gross, barbaric torture by the communists of a prisoner. So I knew that was a signal. The Navy had said that they wanted to see any mail, and so I called the Navy and told them that I had received some mail, and so they sent a couple of naval intelligence people out to look at the letters, and I told them how concerned I was about this, and they said not to worry about it too much. And the man, Mr. Steele, called me back in a couple of days, and he said, I don't want you to worry about the reference to Bobby Tom and Baldy and Red Dog, because they said, you told us that Bobby Tom's last name was Jenkins, Baldy's last name was Chapman, and Red Dog's last name was Davis. And there were 3 people on the missing list who were, of course, Jenkins, Chapman, and Davis, Chapman, and Jenkins. And so that was Jim's way of signaling, which I thought was just absolutely brilliant, signaling that they were there. They asked me to go through the letters and comment on them paragraph by paragraph, which I did. And one day they asked if I would accept a call from a Commander Robert Burroughs in Washington, D.C., if I would accept a call from him, and I said I would. He asked me if I would come to Washington at the government expense, that he would like to talk to me further about the letters. And I thought that was really exciting. I said I don't want to make a big thing of myself, but yes, I'd be more than happy to do that. And Jimmy wanted to take care of his brothers during the night times, and we had a sitter during the daytimes, and so I didn't spend very long, but I went to Washington. And that was my first trip as a POW wife. he said, we would like very much to communicate with your husband covertly. And we wondered if you would consider cooperating with us in a scheme to communicate with him covertly. And I said, well, it sounds dangerous. He said, it is. And I want you to think about it very carefully. I don't want you to give me an answer now. I want you to go home and think about it. I said, well, if he got caught, he'd be killed. And he said, that's right. That's why I want you to think about it. But he said, I do think you have to remember that he has sent out these clues. So I went home and I thought about it, and I thought it was pretty scary, but I did think Jim would want me to do it because he had sent out those clues. Incidentally, when he asked me to cooperate with them in the covert communication, once I had made up my mind to do that, that was a tremendous boost for my morale. Tremendous boost for my morale, even though it was an extremely dangerous thing that I was doing. But, you see, I felt that I was possibly doing something that might help Jim. And the worst thing is just to sit there and keep quiet. That's the worst. You've got to have this feeling of fighting back. So it was a great, great morale boost. I made Commander Barrow's promise that if I cooperated with him, he would always tell me the truth. And after we got the letter back, starting darling and ending your adoring husband, he called me in about 6 weeks and said he was coming out, that he had something to show me. And he took me over to Naval Intelligence headquarters there in San Diego. And he said, I promised you I'd always tell you the truth. And he gave me a folder, and he said, you go into this room and sit down and look at this, and I'll be right outside. And so I looked at it, and it was the extrapolation from Jim's message, saying that he was that the North Vietnamese were experts in torture, and that he was in leg irons 16 hours a day. And I thought I was going to throw up. I pulled the wastebasket over close in case I did. I mean, it was just like somebody took a hammer and whammed it, right? You know, I mean, it's just a stagger. I shouldn't have been so surprised, really, because I knew that the conditions were terrible. But seeing it right there in front of me and knowing it for a fact was really a blow, a very major, devastating blow.
Her worst fears were confirmed. James Stockdale was being held in solitary confinement, in leg irons, and tortured routinely by what the POWs called the ropes. When James Stockdale entered the walls of the prison that became known as the Hanoi Hilton, he was confronted by 3 men who would become his nemesis.
There are 3 people that I met there that all played in the first was Cat. I'll tell you about him. He was a man of culture. He didn't speak English yet, but in a couple of years he'd learned it. But he was very proud that he didn't want to be he wanted to be able to speak reasonably well when he first opened up. But he was just a face in the background. He was the new guy that was going to take over. The guy that was talking when he was sitting in the dark was Rabbit. Rabbit was a good linguist and was a very smart guy. He became my interrogator. And the third intimate Vietnamese, I mean, he was in my face most of the time, was Pig Eye. He first showed up we whispered in heartbreak, and we would notice, who's this guy with an expressionless eye that looks in the peek hole? And somebody said, his eye looks like that of a pig. Well, I named him. I said, that's Pig Eye. And it's, he turned out to be a man about my age, thin, wary, completely emotionless, He didn't have any language ability, nor did he try to get any. But he was more like he was a kind of a pleasure to do business with, when the business at hand was for him to bring me to a point where I submitted.
Although torture had been banned by international law since October 1950, the Vietnamese did not comply. Torture was routine as the guards imposed their will on the POWs.
I remember reading from a book written by the psychiatrist Dr. Carl Jung, and he talked about the imposition of fear and guilt in a person as a means to derive his compliance. I always had that in the back of my mind, that you would destabilize them with pain and impose this fear. And of course, in the case of us, the fear and guilt syndrome was as follows. The guilt we generated because we were so disappointed in our ability to overcome what I'm going to describe as the ropes. And the fear came naturally because they really beat us up and we knew we had to deal with it.
Stockdale learned to deal with and endure what most would find unendurable.
Nobody can beat this system. No American ever walked out of there and said, I beat those ropes. Couldn't do it. You would be taken through this trip that would start with a charge made by an officer, and then for dramatic effect, they would usually have a big long iron bar and they would let that hit the cement and bing, and then they would get out these lugs through which your ankles would be put, and they locked you to the bar. And then he gets out rope, sometimes hemp rope, sometimes other, and he starts the process with you sitting upright and winding this rope to pull your arms back to make your shoulder blades touch. And then you're getting the pain of the squeezing of the ropes. And as time goes on, I'm telling you, this is going to last 40 minutes, and I'm less than a third of the way there now. He bends you forward, kicks off his shoes, stands on your back, and pulls the ropes up from the bottom, and they're applying all of this pressure to these arms. And then at a certain point after that, he takes his foot and pushes the back of your head and puts that right between your feet on the floor, and there you are. And then he'll just tie you up and let you sit there until you say, I submit, because you're being bombarded with the fact that you know you're not going to be able to use your hands when they do take that stuff off, and you won't be able to use them for some weeks, that you are in pain and you are in claustrophobia, and by now you're probably puking from the jackknife position. And somewhere along there, you say, I submit. And we had lots of rules and slogans, and we took pride in making them work for it. You don't realize how much more emotionally degrading is the accepting of voluntarily giving up before you're anywhere near the position we were in. That's depressing. That takes you to the bottom of the barrel. You didn't do your job. You were to make them work for it. So you learn never to fall in that direction, or you're going to have mental problems just because you lack of self-respect. So the good prisoner makes them go through the thing and lets them do their damnedest, and then makes a judgment when he's got to come up. And after they get that submission acknowledged, then your artwork tends to not be a physical matter, but a mental matter into how cheaply you can get off with what they want. They probably want you to write a letter to the Secretary of State. They'll sometimes do things like the Foreign Secretary of State. Now, when the guy said that, I said, okay. I mean, you know, now he's hopelessly screwed up, and every American that reads that's going to laugh. And but you got to be alert to that type of thing.
What the torture masters wanted from the prisoners of war was a confession to war crimes committed by the U.S. servicemen, war crimes that had no basis in reality. They would also often force the men to denounce their government with the use of tape recorders. As Stockdale pointed out, while it was a given that a man would submit, he must not give aid and comfort to their captors.
There was a friend of mine who was in the very position I'm describing. He'd submitted, and now he's trying to use his wits to see how cheaply he can get off. When he was asked, give me the names of the pilots in your squadron that turned in their wings rather than bomb Hanoi, and he said there were only two. One was Clark Kent, and one was Ben Casey. Well, they thought they had, according to Nels Tanner, who was the guy that had the wit to come up with that, they thought they had really gotten a prize because he acted well the given part. He was repentant and he was bent over. And so they shotgunned it all over the world. And this got laughs wherever it was. Somebody sent a San Diego paper, the San Diego Union Tribune's front page. Now, this was a lot of help. There's some anti-war guy here in town sent a page to the commissar, and they opened it up, and it says, and they just see how they're made laughing stocks.
Commander Stockdale found inner strength from two main sources. One, the hope given him from his wife, Sybil, and two, a belief in the ancient philosophy of Stoicism, mainly the works of Epictetus, which he became familiar with in his time at Stanford University, under the tutelage of Phil Rhinelander. To that end, Stockdale created a sense of order, even in the chaos. It was Stockdale and his compatriots that gave the locations in the prison names. Most commonly used were the streets of Las Vegas, a place familiar to airmen, but unknown by their interrogators. Though solitary confinement was the norm for a troublemaker like Stockdale, he was able to stay in touch with his men, using a bottle in the toilet as a mailbox.
Then I was taken and moved down to a little place that was almost as out of touch as the one I was in now, but this is called the Mint. And it was there that I started getting notes from my buddies that I had just left. And we had arranged a signaling place. They had given me directions about a note pickup drop. There was I washed every other day in a kind of an outdoor privy, under which, down there near the guts of it, were cobwebs, and there was a bottle down there. And I was to, if there was a vertical wire, an innocuous vertical wire above here, and here was the signal. If it was bent this way, there was a note in there for me. And vice versa, if I put a note in, it would be the other way. If it was mashed up flush, stay away from it because it's been compromised. But I wanted to get a hold of them. I got a note from Will Forby, and I wanted to reply. I had to use, we would improvise toilet paper, but this is more like coarse toweling. And that would be and I would use just rat droppings for a crayon.
James Stockdale is also credited with coining the phrases Back U.S. Don't bow in public. Stay off the air. Admit no crimes. Never kiss them goodbye. U.S. could be interpreted as United States, but really meant unity over self. Stockdale's belief in the chain of command kept many of the younger, less experienced men hopeful. It was Stockdale's belief that the way to hold unity among the men was to preserve the one way of life which all had in common, and that was life in the military. If an officer showed weakness or told a man under him to deal with this on your own, it was seen as treasonous. The way to keep men alive and hopeful for a return home was to establish some kind of normalcy in this crucible of extremity. But even Stockdale would come to realize that hope is difficult to hold on to under extreme pressure of torture, incarceration, loneliness, and fear. After being in solitary for an extended stay at the Mint, Stockdale was communicating with his men again.
And I was working on this piece of work. This was quite a thrill. I hadn't talked to anybody I was really good in the communication again. And pretty soon a voice said, "What are you doing?" This guy had slipped by me. I had a peephole there, but he was watching me. And he said, I saw you. Your hand was moving. Well, then he left right away, and he came back with a turnkey, and they took me out. And I was able to get the note that was partially done. I'd eat it if I could have done it, but I didn't have time. I just put it in the crotch of my pants. And the guard came out, and they frisked me, and they didn't find anything. Then he led me back in, but here it was creeping down my leg, and I thought, oh, my God, and here it came right out there. So the guard grabbed it and ran away, and I knew I was in trouble. I went down and laid down and just was sweating when an officer we called Bug, who was the man that was supervising this, he said, "Get up. Tomorrow is the day we bring you down." They were probably going to get the first team in there. "You get in that chair." And then they put traveling irons on me, which meant that I could waddle, but I couldn't certainly run. And then they put kind of loose ropes on me and left me there. Now, for 4 years, I'd been a prisoner, and I'd been the senior guy in many instances, usually. And I had conducted organizations that were making life better for us and worse for them, the enemies, and the way they handle this, when they have a full-fledged movement afoot with a well-identified leader, in this case me, they start pulling people in to interrogate them, to develop more background on the nature of the organization. What are they capable of? Are they communicating outside the camp, which we were, by an ingenious method of putting notes on the new guys as they went through shakedown, and then they would take them out to these outlying camps. So sometimes in these purges, people die. And I took aboard the fact that I could blame myself for some of these deaths. And was I doing the right thing? I didn't know. I had doubts. I was depressed. I saw no end. So I decided to check out. I made the decision that I knew how to do it. So I went over and went right to the light, switched it off, put the heel of my hand up on that pane, and didn't bash it out. I just cracked it, and then I started bringing in the shards, and then I went back over in the chair and I turned the light on and started working with these wrists and squeezing blood, and then it was coming easy, and I was getting groggy, and I fell on my face without knowing it.
James Stockdale was not aware of this at the time, But during the time he was trying to check out, as he called it, his wife Sybil was in Paris, demanding that the North Vietnamese government treat POWs humanely. While James was frustrating the efforts of his Vietnamese captors, Sybil was organizing the POW wives.
There were 13 of us. One of the wives was not very impressed with their keep quiet policy, and she said we'd all like to get together. So I invited everybody that I knew about, and of course we got it by word of mouth in San Diego, and you know there's no communication system like a bunch of Navy wives. So I invited everybody to come for lunch, and we started at 12 o'clock, and at 5 o'clock everybody was still there. This is the first time we'd ever been together with others in the same circumstance, and there was just this outpouring of exchange of information of who was being told what and so forth. And then we agreed that we would meet on a regular basis as squadron wives. You know, you'd always meet every month and so forth, and so we became a group that would meet regularly, and we wanted somebody from Washington to come to San Diego and tell us what was going on. We couldn't get anybody to come, and we'd been writing letters individually, and then we decided we would organize. I didn't know anything about the way you're supposed to organize a group. I looked the word league up in the dictionary. That seemed to fit. And we gave ourselves the name of the League of Wives of American Vietnam Prisoners of War. We didn't say missing in action, because if they were missing, they were either dead or they were prisoners of war. We rented a mailbox. We rented a mailbox. We had stationery printed up. We elected officers. We instructed our secretary to send a letter to Washington asking somebody from the State Department to come and talk to us. In 3 weeks, Harriman's assistant was out there and talked to us. That, of course, showed us what organization will do. That they responded when we asked them as a league to come. They didn't respond at all when we wrote individually.
There was a new president entering the White House, and Sybil and the League of Wives of American Prisoners of War were ready to greet him.
Those were the days of sit-ins and stand-ins and all these things. And so I decided when Nixon was inaugurated, we'd have a telegraph in. And so I communicated with as many wives as I could around the country. I think I knew 60 at the time. And they, of course, communicated with others, and we had a telegraph in. And the day after Nixon's inauguration, we had 2,000 telegrams on his desk asking that the prisoner of war situation be given this high priority consideration. And Alex Butterfield told me not too long ago, he was in Coronado, and he said, you know, that really impressed him. It was like night and day. Night, dark night was the Johnson administration. Bright, sunny day was the Nixon administration. They changed the policy on the 19th of May, 1969. I was teaching school at the time, and they called me at 7:30 in the morning before I left for school, and they said, at 10 o'clock this morning, 11 o'clock, something like that this morning, Washington time, Melvin Laird, the then Secretary of Defense, is going to stand up and acknowledge the fact publicly that our prisoners are not being treated humanely in Hanoi. I mean, that was a major victory. Imagine that. Our own government was... Jim had been in prison for 4 years by then. The first wives that went to the North Vietnamese embassy in Paris were from Texas, and they were sponsored by Ross Perot. And they went over to ask whether or not they were wives or widows. Their husbands were all listed as missing. Then our thinking was that it would be good to have a representative group from the League go. So as a representative group from the League, we were not incorporated yet, but we were a National League of Families. Having become so by my magic wand of naming us as such.
In Paris, defying their own government, the League challenged the North Vietnamese delegation to the peace talks, to give a full accounting of the Americans they held.
There were 6 of us all together who went to Paris to see the North Vietnamese. And that was very, very, very scary for me because, of course, I was, by this time, deeply involved in this covert communication. And my terror was that maybe they would confront me about that they might know about that and that they might confront me about that. And we had to wait about a week before we saw them in Paris. And I would have the dry heaves almost every day. And I did have some really good sleeping pills that would allow me to go off to sleep at night, but I was scared out of my wits. And when we got into the North Vietnamese embassy, after we'd had our opening remarks and so forth, Xuan Nguyen was Xuan Thuy was in Hanoi. So we saw the second in charge, Xuan Nguyen. And he said, "We know all about you, Mrs. Stockdale." And boy, my heart just dropped. And then he pulled out this, out of his pocket, he pulled out this clipping of me sitting on the steps of the Capitol in Washington. And he said, "We know that you are the organizer," and so forth. So that made me feel a lot better because I was scared to death about when he said, "We know all about you."
Many of the American POWs credit Sybil Stockdale for changing their plight in the prison camps. Her efforts in connecting other wives of MIAs and POWs gave rise to support for the families of military men. Also, her proactive approach in dealing with the Vietnamese and the Nixon and Johnson administrations was truly groundbreaking because it gave a real and cogent voice to a group of citizens that had previously not been heard. February of 1973, Sybil's hard work was finally rewarded.
The phone call came, Nixon came on that night of the 27th of January and announced. And so I guess it was the next morning that they called. Admiral Moore called first, Admiral Zumwalt called. And Jim came home on the 12th of February. They came out on the 12th. They didn't come home, but they came out on the 12th of February, so not very long. Not long enough, really, which seems like an odd thing to say, but it had been so long, we needed more time to get ready. We wanted time to get new clothes, and we had lots of work to do. Had to go on a diet and all that kind of stuff. They first arrived at Clark Air Force Base, and that's when I first saw him. We first saw him on film getting off the airplane. And then there was a phone call, and by the grace of God, our son Stan taped that phone call.
Jim? Yes?
This is Jim, Sib.
Can you hear me?
Very well. Do you hear me?
Yes?
I love you so, and I'm so proud of you all, and I've heard so many things about what you've been doing and how active you've been.
Oh, I love you, Jim. Are you all right?
Yes, I am. I'm in very, very good health. Organically, I've got a stiff leg and a bump shoulder, but I have no health problems at all.
Is it your right leg?
No, it's my left.
And your right shoulder?
No, it's my left in both cases, but I wouldn't worry about either. It sort of gives me a little style. I had a little trouble with the ramp, but I wasn't used to going down inclined planes.
Well, I thought you looked wonderful.
Right away.
I thought you looked wonderful.
He said, my leg is stiff, but he said, I think it gives my walk a little style. So I knew he was okay when I heard the humor. And it was it's kind of hard to talk to your husband on the telephone when you haven't seen him for 8 years. I mean, but it seemed fairly natural.
In recognition of his heroic resistance to the North Vietnamese and his willingness to sacrifice his life rather than capitulate to their continued demands, in 1976, Rear Admiral James B. Stockdale was awarded the Medal of Honor. In recognition of her efforts as organizer and first chairperson of the National League of Families of Prisoners and Missing in Southeast Asia, Mrs. Sybil Stockdale received the Navy Distinguished Public Service Award. She is the only active duty Navy wife ever to be so recognized. Stockdale retired from the Navy in 1996 as a Vice Admiral. Sybil Stockdale proved that a good Navy wife can stick to her guns with the same determination and courage as her husband. As for the Admiral, he is a rare breed of a man, brave when the situation was most dire, and always acutely aware of the strength that can be garnered in numbers. He is the quintessential example of a hero, stepping into harm's way to protect the higher ideal. There is no greater sacrifice. Many lessons can be learned from the lives of Jim and Sybil Stockdale, two ordinary Americans who exhibited extraordinary bravery.
When we were a surgical hospital, of course, all the nurses worked in the emergency room or the recovery room unless you were an OR nurse, and I was not an OR nurse. So I worked in the emergency room, and it was just a humongously big room that was like the size of a aircraft hangar that had sawhorses all over the room. And of course, the sawhorses were there to accept the litters that were coming in off the choppers, and hanging from the ceiling all along by those sawhorses were these wire hooks, and the wire hooks were there for the IVs, to hang the IVs on when the troops were being brought in. On a quiet day when there were no casualties, it was just a matter of the room being there with the wind blowing through and blowing those iron hooks around, and those empty sawhorses being there waiting for the next patient, and then all of a sudden the radio.
This is Raider Alpha 6. I have an urgent dust-off mission. Coordinates.
I hear the radio. It's dust-off. Dust-off is calling our hospital and telling us where they are, how many casualties they got, what kind they are, and how far away they are, what their, ETA 4 minutes or whatever, and what kind of injuries they have, so we know what to get the doctor, the triage officer ready. And our hospital was on a bluff about 85 feet high, overlooking the South China Sea, and the helipad was right outside the door to the emergency room, so that when the helicopters started coming in, the wind, of course, from the propellers just blew right through the emergency room. And you could hear them. To this day, I can hear a Huey. I mean, it's a very distinct sound, and that's what the dust-off pilots used. And I must say I give all the credit in the world. My heroes of Vietnam are the combat medics and the dust-off pilots, because they saved so many lives just by putting a chopper down in a place where no one thought they could ever put a chopper, and getting those victims on that chopper and getting them to the hospitals as quickly as they did.
I loved aviation, I guess, since I was a little kid. For some reason, I knew that I had a fascination with flying machines, and I really never planned on flying helicopters. I wanted to be a fighter pilot and join this. I was in uniform most of my life, Cub Scouts, Boy Scouts, Civil Air Patrol, ROTC at the University of Connecticut. For some reason, I felt comfortable there. But I always had a fascination for aircraft, and I always knew I wanted to fly. And as I got older, it got to the point I didn't care who I flew for. As long as I was a military aviator, that's what I wanted. And the Army afforded me the chance to go from high school to flight school. And I had planned, again, to possibly apply for naval aviation, but I was like a semester short. And looked into the Army, and it looked good. And there was a war going on, which I wasn't particularly interested in getting into, but again, a military aviator would like to know what he would do under fire. And it's not the greatest place to be. I don't recommend it, but I guess that's part of like being a professional athlete or a football player or whatever. You have to get into the big game to know what you're going to do. So, but aviation was always a love of mine, still is.
I was not the military type as far as any of that training goes. I just was hoping, that maybe medical, I'd get into the heart, I'll be all right in that. But I was a kind of sad sack type guy with my weapon upside down, and that's one picture I should have brought. You know, and that kind of stuff. I was just kind of booting along in that, and I got through the basic. Now, once I got through the basic, then I went on down to San Antonio, Texas, into the medical field. And the Vietnam thing, I was confused. I really didn't know what was going on. I wasn't all that upset about if I was going to go, because I found out as soon as we got down here at Fort Sam Houston, the majority of medics that were going to go to Vietnam. Your class, you know, your whole class was just about going to go because there was such a turnover of medics. You were trained a little different, though. It must have been very naive, and I was already 22 years old, but naive because they made it sound like, well, you'll get over there, and if you don't get into a hospital, you'll be hooked up with a combat unit, but you'll kind of go out to the war, and then you'll come back, and you'll be back for a while, you know, like you got your wall locker and all this kind of stuff and that. So I kind of thought, well, this won't be too bad, I didn't think. Well, it was totally different once you got off that plane. Very different. At first, you didn't know you were going to combat yet. You know, you're still a medic. You're still thinking you might go to a big hospital or something like that. So the heat hits you, and all these guys are all kind of definitely different than you. You got crisp uniforms and all these guys are waiting and applauding you as you're getting off because they're going home finally. And that reality just didn't hit me yet, what was going on. The big hit was there was a lot of paper shuffling and stuff like that for the next 48 hours, and then they lined you up, and then they started saying where you were going. Out of the 38 medics that were with me, they kind of grouped you all together. Two of us goofing off, just saying that, well, we know we're going to go to an infantry unit. We were only two that went to an infantry unit. All the others did go to hospitals.
Probably the first month that I was there, I cried every day, all the time. I mean, it was while I was on duty, when I was over in my room at night, or if I was working nights when I was in my room during the day. Probably the only time I didn't cry is when I was sleeping, because it was just overwhelming. It was absolutely overwhelming. I couldn't have ever been prepared for anything like that. Even though I went through basic training, even though at Fort Sam, when we went through basic training, they took us through this exercise called the Vietnam Village. That was just to get us used to the country. They couldn't possibly have prepared us for what we saw and what we were expected to do, and to emotionally be prepared, professionally be prepared, have enough character to survive it. It was just overwhelming.
Basically, we unloaded the aircraft, put them together, test flew them, and again, most of the guys I flew with had been there before. So I'm flying with second tour boys that were very, very good at what they did, and showed you how to do things with that UH-1 that was not taught to you in flight school. I remember one captain telling me, he said, "You're probably not going to make it out of here alive, but listen to what I have to tell you, and let me show you how to do this, and maybe you'll have a better chance at it." So that was a real sobering speech this guy made before we climbed into the cockpit. And I was all ears and eyes. Basically, yes or no, sir, show me what you have so I can stay alive. And lessons well learned, which you pass on again to somebody else as they come on board.
You were popped out of a helicopter, just kind of thrown out there with your bags and that, and you're there, you're out there. You know, you didn't know what anything was about or anything like that. You were the medic. One medic was with each platoon. The next day I went with the mortar platoon. And that first mission, the next day mission, was reality. Going after this, I don't like using the terms, but crispy critters, a couple guys down in a helicopter, going out looking for them and stuff like that. And that's when it hit. And it said, then you wondered, what the heck? And like I said, I had some age going for me, but I had one plus being a medic, because right away then you had a job. You know, these kids that were infantrymen and people like that, those poor guys, you know, they had jobs, but you know, at least what I could do is I could hide behind my job. I could say, well, I have no idea what this Vietnam thing is, who that poor guy is we're shooting at or anything like that, but I'm here to take care of my man. And I always thank the dear Lord for that. I always thank being a medic. I carried a weapon. I carried a 45 in plastic, you know, so it wouldn't get wet. And I think I only had to take it out one time, and thank God the poor guy that I was taken out to was just as young and scared, and he took off. You know, I was always very, very happy that I was a medic.
At the time, I think I was the most afraid was when the action was over with, is when we were coming out of Ben Tray at about 800 feet in the Delta. It was the second lift of the day, and we got hit pretty bad with automatic weapons fire, and the kid flying next to me, I thought was killed. The bullets came through the cockpit, and I thought they went underneath his chicken plate, and he slumped over on the controls, and I was flying the aircraft. Well, I didn't even know this guy very well. In fact, the day earlier that day, we talked about who was a magnet ass, me or him, and he said, well, neither. I mean, I've been hit, but not that many times. And the second lift of the day, we get hit. We get chopped up really bad. Little did I know I had battle damage in the tail rotor section. Well, I had another ship come up, and I said I was hit, and another ship come up, looked me over, and I wasn't leaking any fluid, so I looked down and said everything was in the green, and we went to the hospital area, and there was already a helicopter on the pad, and I chose not to land there. There was two-story buildings all around the helipad there at the hospital, so I decided to land over a ditch, and of course this kid still slumped over the controls, and there was nobody on board with me and the crew, and we got down to the bottom, and I don't know what snapped back there, but I lost my tail rotor. I don't know whether I lost the shaft or the control. I had no idea. There was no way of knowing. And she started to spin out of the control. Well, I couldn't do a hovering out of rotation because I was over a ditch and I was next to the hospital. And if I'd have rolled this thing in a ball, I'd have killed everybody in the hospital. So I opted to go back in the air. And at this time, the airplane's going out of control, going round and round, and I'm trying to learn how to fly a helicopter without the tail rotor controls, and it's quite an interesting experience. And the guy next to me who decides to wake up and get out of controls with me, which is a no-no. And we went round and round, and finally I landed the aircraft, and right there at the hospital area, where I wasn't going to land in the first place, and they took him into the hospital, and I shut the aircraft down and got out and sat down and couldn't get up. I remember a bunch of guys from the area came over and wanted to talk to me. I just could not stand up. They had to help me up. I guess that was the worst I ever physically felt as far as being afraid. And I can't remember how long that was. It might have been 10 minutes. It might have been a half hour. I know I finally obviously did get up, but I was pretty afraid. When it was going on, I just remember saying to myself, I know I'm going to die, but I'm very busy. I remember saying that. And the tower kept screaming, what was the matter? And I didn't have time to talk to him. I had an airplane that was totally out of control, and you know, it's kind of an instantaneous course on how to fly an aircraft out of control. They didn't cover that in flight school, by the way. I think my first experience with medevac was up in Icor in the mountains, and I pulled some night medevac in the mountains, and that's hairy. Night mountain flying without much illumination, unless you know the area of operation real well, will get you killed because you're flying around mountains and stuff like that. But we had people that were hit. They had a fire base under a mortar attack, and they scrambled myself and another chief warrant officer. And he'd been there before, although I did most of the flying. And we had to go into a saddle between two artillery batteries where we had to pick up the wounded. And it was dark, and we landed to a strobe light. Basically what they do is they put a little light that would blink, and you land to that. We had a bit of a moon, so I could barely make it out. And we just didn't do that much night flying in the mountains. But this time they were hit real bad. We had to go, and we went. And I remember making the approach, and although we turned off all our lights, I think I hit the landing light really quickly just before I touched down to see where I was landing, and shut it off. I don't think the mortar attack was up more than a minute, maybe two, before we went in. And I remember sitting there between the saddle, waiting for them to bring the wounded down, and we were at full RPM thinking they're going to drop one right down on these blades. I mean, I'm not going to make it out of here, and just praying they're not going to hit us again. Knowing they saw the landing light come on, and knowing they were reloading the mortar tubes. And I'm thinking, I don't know why I'm doing this for a living, but if I ever get out of this alive, I will go to church every Sunday, and you're making all kinds of pacts with God to see if you can get through this. And all of a sudden you look up, and here they come running down with the stretchers and the guys with the bottles in them, and you put them on board, and you grab a handful of pitch, and you're out of here thinking, oh, man, how did I get through this one? And you come to find out you do it again the next night. Don't ask me why, but you do. That's because that's why you're an Army pilot.
That was one of my worst ones. I didn't think I'd be able to talk about it, but I guess I can. That was one of my worst ones. I was supposed to get on this aircraft and go in later, and my buddy said, why don't you go get the beer? You go on the first one. And I went on the first one, and then probably what happened, we had a lot of terrible, goofy accidents. We got killed a lot by our own crap. Our own stuff, you know. And I waited about an hour and a half, and my buddy wasn't coming on any of those aircrafts. And finally, me and a priest went down to one of the tents, and we found his body where he got blown up. Those are the things, you know, and you don't know why. You got your friend laying in a tent, you know, that's death tent, you know, and you're going by looking, and you got Vietnamese there, the enemy. They're treating him almost better or something, you know. It's probably all up in here. That was bad. That was rough. I started kicking a few of those, and I'm not a violent person at all. And that's when the chaplain took me. The chaplains are really aces as far as I'm going. And that was my roughest. That was my roughest. Young kid from Alabama that was a conscientious objector, changed his mind. He carried a .45, and I lost him. And he was one of my best buddies. That's the one that went on the aircraft after me. That wasn't easy. But you pop back. You pop back because you got to take care of those others. That's the thing. You had that other. I mean, I don't know what I would have done if I didn't have that job. We were getting battled pretty bad, really bad one night. Just soldiers getting killed left and right, and we had helicopters keep coming in, and Ghost Rider was the one guy's name. He didn't care. He wasn't a medevac, but he was going to come in and he was going to get my people. And he came in 4 different times to come in and get my people. And the last time I was wounded, I didn't know it at the time, and he got hit. He got hit, and his other pilot was he was all right, but things were shaking up. So I got my people in, and I got into one of the seats, and I helped them. You know, we got the aircraft out, and we got it out. And then once we got back to the base where we were at, I sat on this little ammo can, crying, thinking that I'm gonna be in trouble, you know, because I was with that aircraft, and I didn't leave my people, but I needed to. This was something I pulled, and then I found out that I was going to be awarded all this stuff and everything, and that. The wound was the butt wound. And I tell you, there's nothing, the butt wound just doesn't get you. That's one of those Purple Hearts you don't talk a lot when you get hit in the butt.
You hear that Huey coming, whether you're on duty or not, you hear it coming, and the first thing you do is run to the emergency room to see, if you're not on duty, to see if they need extra help, or how many casualties do they have coming. And you stand at the door and you watch the chopper land, and the medics run out. Whoever's available runs out to the chopper to start bringing the gurneys in. You see other wounded soldiers that are the walking wounded helping another one of their buddies or wanting to carry a litter. They bring them in and they start lining them up, and you just go to the first litter and wait for the triage officer to try to tell you who needs, who's in what category, who needs care, who can, what can we do for whomever. Of course, the worst category was the expectant. And those were the troops that we knew that were going to die no matter what we did for them. And probably the hardest job there was the job of the triage officer. And when a doctor wasn't available to do it, a nurse had to do it. And to make that decision, no matter what we do for this guy, he's going to die. And if we put him over in a litter in the corner and take care of 20 other guys, we can save lives rather than taking several hours to take care of one guy that's going to die anyway. And that was the hardest part. That was the part that where you begin to question, what am I here for? What value? What am I doing? If I can't take care of this one person and make a difference, maybe I shouldn't be here. Maybe I can't really make a difference with anybody. That's when you begin to say, I better, I got to get rid of these feelings. I got to stop feeling this way, because I got to realize it's, what we can do for the greatest number. And we had in our recovery room, we had an area of the recovery room where we would put the guys that were expectant. And if you were off duty, it was just something you did as the nurse. You would go to that bedside and you would clean the troop up if he's still in his bloody fatigues or whatever, and wash his face, wash his hands, talk to him, hold his hand. And it just was something that there was no schedule that said, Barb, you're scheduled to go sit with this guy today that's dying. It was just, I might be there for 4 or 5 hours, and then all of a sudden another nurse would show up. And we would just sit there at their bedside and hold their hand, talk to them until they died, just so they wouldn't be alone. And sometimes we were able to find out some personal information, and we could write a letter to their families and say, I was the nurse that was with Joe when he died, and I just wanted to tell you that he died peacefully, and he was not alone. And sometimes you get letters back from those parents or that wife or whomever, thanking you for that. In most cases, I'd have to say that the soldier that was dying might have known that I was beside him, but he was unable to show me that physically because his brain was dead or his body was near dead. Occasionally, you might get a responsive grasp in your hand, but it was usually, at the time, it meant a lot if you could feel some kind of reaction. To be able to see a tear from an eye or something, but that really didn't happen. In most cases, the troop was so far gone that it was impossible. The ones that were very gut-wrenching were the troops that came in on the chopper that were still conscious, that had lost a leg, and they're grabbing you and saying, "Nurse, don't let me die. Nurse, don't let me die. Nurse, my leg hurts," and they don't have a leg, and it's trying to deal with them was emotionally as gut-wrenching as staying by the bedside of a troop that was dying. People ask me today, how did you survive Vietnam? How did you survive the carnage of every day? Every day was a mass casualty. Every day it was one body after another that had bits and pieces blown apart or major parts missing. And I tell people to this day, the only way I can survive was just to turn myself off. I could no longer get involved with this patient. I couldn't worry about, this is Joe from Iowa on this stretcher. To me, this was just another number, another victim. I couldn't get emotionally involved with my patients the way I'd been trained to do as a nurse. The only way I could be efficient as a nurse was to turn myself off so that I could function and perhaps save a life that I wouldn't normally be able to do if I was standing there thinking about how horrible it was that this was happening to them. So emotion-wise, after a while I was just numb. I didn't think about who was doing what. I was just thinking about doing my job and getting through each day and surviving.